The doctors
You
stood in
won't
silence
believe what
outside the
happened
glass-walled
to
ICU
me
room, their faces
today.
pale, their shoulders heavy with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from long hours but from helplessness, and inside that room lay 8-year-old Lily Carter, the only daughter of Victor Carter, the steel-hearted CEO known across the city for building empires and breaking competitors without mercy. A man who could buy hospitals yet now stood powerless with his forehead pressed against the glass, watching machines breathe for the little girl who once laughed so loudly it filled his mansion, and the lead surgeon finally spoke the words no parent ever survives unchanged, "We've done everything we can," and in that moment Victor Carter, the billionaire feared by boardrooms and politicians alike, collapsed into a chair like a man who had lost not just a child but his identity, because Lily wasn't just his daughter. She was the last piece of warmth left after his wife died years earlier, and the diagnosis, an ultra-rare autoimmune neurological disorder, had baffled specialists flown in from 3 countries, drained millions from accounts Victor never checked, and turned hope into a fragile, flickering thing that now seemed ready to go out, while down the hall, unnoticed, sat Daniel Reed, a single father in worn boots and a faded jacket, holding a plastic cup of cold coffee with trembling hands. His own daughter Mia asleep at home under the watch of a neighbor because Daniel worked nights as a hospital janitor after losing his wife to cancer, a man invisible to the powerful, yet carrying scars deeper than any CEO in that building, and Daniel had been cleaning that ICU wing for weeks, overhearing whispered discussions, seeing Lily's chart left open once, recognizing symptoms that made his heart race because years ago, before life shattered him, Daniel had been a biomedical researcher whose experimental work was dismissed, defunded, and forgotten after he chose family over fame, and as Victor stormed past, barking orders into his phone about lawsuits and donations and finding another damn doctor, Daniel finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady, "Sir, let me help her," and the words landed like an insult, Victor spinning around ready to crush whoever dared speak such nonsense, only to see a janitor, a nobody, daring to offer hope where medicine had surrendered, and Victor's rage exploded, accusing Daniel of cruelty, of playing with a dying child's life. But Daniel didn't flinch, because he had once stood where Victor stood, begging doctors to try something, anything, for his own wife, and he said softly, "I know what they're missing," and something in his eyes, pain, certainty, and refusal to beg, made Victor pause, because desperation humbles even kings, and with nothing left to lose, Victor allowed Daniel 5 minutes, 5 minutes that would either confirm his hopelessness or change everything. And as Daniel studied Lily through the glass, murmuring details about immune response loops and neural inflammation that made the doctors freeze, the first crack appeared in the wall of certainty that had already buried the child, and far from the ICU, cameras followed Victor's empire, but none of them captured the moment when a single dad with nothing left but knowledge and courage stepped forward to challenge fate itself, because sometimes miracles don't come wearing lab coats or titles. Sometimes they arrive quietly, pushing a mop, carrying a past no one bothered to ask about, and if this story already has your heart racing, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will prove that hope can come from the most unexpected places, and Chapter 2 will change everything you think you know about power, sacrifice, and second chances. The room felt smaller once Daniel Reed stepped inside, as if the weight of every failed treatment, every whispered prognosis, and every silent prayer had compressed the air, and Victor Carter stood rigid near the door, arms crossed not in confidence but in fear disguised as authority, watching this janitor, this single dad, wash his hands with the care of a surgeon while doctors hovered nearby, their skepticism barely concealed, because the idea that a man who cleaned floors at night could see what they could not bruised their pride. Yet Daniel didn't look at them, his eyes fixed on Lily, her tiny chest rising and falling with mechanical rhythm, and as he leaned closer, memories flooded him of another hospital room years ago, another machine breathing for someone he loved, another time when he had begged experts to listen, and his voice trembled only slightly as he explained that Lily's condition wasn't just an autoimmune attack but a cascading feedback loop triggered by a rare genetic marker that caused her immune system to misfire after common viral exposure. Something missed because it didn't appear in standard panels, something Daniel had once written about in a research paper that was shelved when funding disappeared, and as he spoke, One doctor scoffed, another checked the chart, and Victor's heart pounded so loud he barely heard the words, until Daniel said, "She doesn't need stronger suppression, she needs interruption," and silence fell, the kind that arrives when certainty is challenged, because Daniel proposed a controversial, unapproved treatment using a specific sequence of immune modulators combined with controlled hypothermia, a protocol never tested on children, never approved, but theoretically capable of resetting the loop, destroying Lily's nervous system. And Victor exploded then, shouting about risk and lawsuits and his daughter being a test subject, but Daniel met his eyes and said quietly, "She's dying anyway," and the truth of it struck harder than any insult, because Victor knew it, the doctors knew it, and the machines knew it, and in that moment, power meant nothing, money meant nothing, and the only thing left was choice. And after what felt like an eternity, Victor whispered, "If this fails," and Daniel answered, "then I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life, just like everything else I couldn't save." And something in that confession broke Victor's resistance, because this wasn't ambition speaking, it was loss, and consent was signed with shaking hands, and the procedure began under emergency authorization while the hospital buzzed with tension, nurses moving faster, doctors double-checking calculations they never believed they'd use, and Daniel guiding them not as a janitor, not as a disgraced researcher, but as the man who understood the storm raging inside Lily's body. And hours passed like years as temperature dropped, medication flowed, monitors spiked and dipped, and at one terrifying moment Lily's heart rate faltered, alarms screaming, Victor collapsing to his knees convinced he had killed his child by trusting a stranger, until Daniel shouted instructions with a clarity that cut through panic, stabilizing her just long enough for the final phase to begin. And when it was over, there was no applause, no celebration, only waiting, the cruelest part of hope. And dawn crept through the windows as Victor sat beside Lily's bed for the first time in days, afraid to touch her, afraid to believe. And then it happened, a twitch of her fingers, so small it could have been imagined, until her eyelids fluttered and a monitor beeped differently, and a nurse gasped, and a doctor whispered, "That's not possible." But Lily breathed on her own, shallow at first, then stronger, and Victor sobbed openly, gripping Daniel's arm like a lifeline, repeating, "Thank you," until words lost meaning, and news spread fast, faster than truth ever does, turning Daniel into a mystery, a rumor, a miracle man. While Victor did something no one expected, he stood before cameras not to boast, but to admit he had been wrong, announcing that the man who saved his daughter was a single father who cleaned hospital floors and deserved recognition, funding, and a second chance. And when Daniel returned home that night, exhausted and overwhelmed, his daughter Mia ran into his arms asking why he looked like he'd been crying, and he held her tighter than ever, knowing some battles are won not with power, but with courage, humility, and love. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes often walk unnoticed among us, subscribe to the channel now, because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us why hope should never be ignored. And the next story may change your heart just as deeply. The world didn't slow down after Lily Carter opened her eyes, it accelerated, and Daniel Reed felt it immediately, because miracles never arrive quietly for long, and within days reporters camped outside the hospital, executives whispered his name in boardrooms, and medical journals requested interviews from the same man who had once been escorted out of research facilities for being too idealistic. While Victor Carter stood beside him through it all, not as a CEO towering over an employee but as a father forever changed, a man who now understood that power without compassion was emptiness. And yet Daniel struggled under the attention, because every praise reminded him of the wife he couldn't save, the nights he had cried alone after scrubbing floors, the years he had hidden brilliance behind survival. And when Victor offered him a permanent role heading a new medical innovation wing named after Lily, Daniel hesitated, not because he lacked ambition, but because he feared hope more than failure, knowing how fragile it could be, until Lily herself settled the matter, weak but smiling, reaching for Daniel's hand and saying, "You promised you'd help other kids too," and something inside him healed then, not completely, but enough, and the Carter Foundation was born within weeks, funding rare disease research ignored by profit-driven systems, staffed by overlooked minds and second-chance souls. And Daniel made one rule clear from the start: that no one would ever be dismissed because of their background, their title, or their clothes, because genius does not wear a uniform. And years later, as Lily ran across a sunlit lawn laughing with Mia like sisters by choice, Victor watched from a distance with tears he no longer hid, understanding that the day the doctors gave up was the day life finally taught him humility. And when Daniel stood at a podium addressing young researchers, he spoke not of triumph but of responsibility, reminding them that sometimes the difference between life and death is not knowledge alone, but the courage to speak when the world tells you to stay silent. And as applause filled the hall, Daniel thought of the night he pushed a mop past an ICU door, carrying nothing but grief and conviction, never imagining it would lead here. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that the most powerful heroes are often the ones we overlook, subscribe to this channel, because every story we share is a reminder that kindness, courage, and second chances can still change the world, sometimes in seconds, sometimes forever.